Welcome, everyone, to the Vegan Family Kitchen. I'm delighted to have you today to talk about perhaps my favorite topic, something that has been my passion since starting in the Vegan Family Kitchen in 2017, which is this idea of cooking without thinking, cooking in all freedom, without recipes, without having to follow the instructions that somebody laid out in a book, without having to go line by line and starting to feel frazzled if you've skipped a part. What I realized early on when I started doing meal planning for other people is that recipes are very similar to each other. There are patterns that repeat over and over and over again. And once you see the patterns and you're fully aware of them, you can start to improvise your own dishes based on fresh produce and that are seasonal ingredients. Often you can also use frozen, but it's nice to use seasonal produce and pantry ingredients. With a minimalistically stocked pantry, it is possible to do quite a bit as long as you start to use what I call sometimes the grammar of cooking, understanding, or even the syntax, how the different parts connect to each other, and it ends up being the same many times over. Of course, there are fancy recipes out there. If you've ever been to something like a fancy Michelin-starred or Michelin-mentioned restaurant, you'll receive this beautiful plate with, let's say, some mushroom preparation, and there will be 5 different kinds of mushrooms all cooked differently with a emulsion of hazelnuts and a sprinkle of some fancy mix of spices, and it's beautiful and it's a delight. And there's no way you're going to make this on a weeknight at home ever. Those recipes are not created without thinking, but that's not what we eat on a day-to-day basis at home. And in fact, that's not even really what we want to eat, because having comfort in the food we eat, having some level of repetition, while at the same time eating a diversity of ingredients, is what most people appreciate on a day-to-day basis. So if you want to eat food that's made following exotic recipes, this is not a good workshop for you. However, if you want to learn how to prepare the basic, simple, yet delicious everyday meals that are healthy and tasty at the same time, and that you can prepare every night at home, every lunch as well, if you need to, in a way that is sustainable, that will not make you feel tired and sick of cooking. If you want to learn those, this is the right conversation to be a part of today. So thank you for being here. Stick around. I'm sure you're going to find this helpful. I strongly recommend, there's going to be a link below to download the cheat sheet, Cooking Without Thinking, Quick and Simple Meal Improv Guide. And once you have this, it will help you. You can print it out, stick it inside your kitchen cabinet door. And when you are at home, it's dinner time and you don't know what to do, open it and just follow the instructions. And you're probably going to need the instructions a few times, but with a little bit of practice, you're going to be able to do this without the instructions anymore, because you are going to develop the muscle memory, the neural pathways in your brain to just execute on this after a while. And the good thing about cooking is that, well, we tend to get hungry most days and we need to eat. So we have so many opportunities to practice. Sometimes we don't make progress very fast. We expect to get better in days or weeks. It may take some months before you get better, but I can absolutely guarantee you that if you practice cooking without thinking 3, 4, 5 times per week over the course of the next year, you're going to be in a completely different place 12 months from now. So let's get started and look at this together. The number one step when you are trying to cook without thinking is to look at what you have. Let the ingredients you already have in your kitchen do the thinking for you. They're there. Just ask them what they think. First step should always be to look at the produce section. So that's the first step on that cheat sheet. Produce. Keep in mind the produce should be about half of the dish you make by volume. Roughly, just think about it. You know, maybe if we weighed it or if we measure it by volume, it would be a little bit different, but think of it as half. Each person would probably have 2 cups worth of vegetables on their plate, but of course, when you cook them, they reduce, they're not so big anymore. If you're cooking a standard recipe, the kinds of recipes that are written for 3 to 4 people, that would mean about this much vegetables that you would be holding in your hands. And so you open your fridge, and what do you find there? I strongly recommend, I have a blog post somewhere that I will link below about the vegetables that I always make sure to have in my fridge. And one of those will always be onions. And I tend to like red onions because they're a little bit more nutritious than yellow onions. I find the taste agrees with me more, but that's at the end of the day a personal preference. And yes, I do keep them in the fridge, largely because when they're cold, they don't make me cry so much when I chop them. and they preserve just fine. Everybody says you're supposed to keep the onions outside the fridge, but I haven't kept my onions in the fridge for over 15 years now, and so far, so good. Maybe the problems will start happening next year. I don't know. But take an onion. You should definitely have an onion in the fridge. Maybe you don't, but typically you will. There will probably be garlic or ginger, some kind of aromatic ingredient there. I'm very much hoping that you're going to have some kind of leafy greens, maybe cruciferous green vegetables. In my case, I always make sure to stock boxed greens. There's no shame in having boxed greens. These ones here are a mix of baby chard, baby spinach, and baby kale. I like it when there's more kale, typically, because kale is a cruciferous vegetable. But, you know, even if those are the only greens you eat, they're fine, they're delicious, and we should always put the greens forward on our plate. Think of a base of greens and then add more things on top. And then what else are you going to find? Well, some other colorful vegetables. So in my own fridge today, I found a Japanese eggplant. I had a yellow bell pepper. I found some broccoli. I practically always buy broccoli. I think it's my favorite vegetable. And I'm not cheating. This is happening for real. I found some herbs. So I had this bunch of parsley that I must have bought on the weekend, not very long ago. It's looking pretty fresh. And I have this half-eaten, not so good-looking bunch of cilantro remaining. Mostly its stems, but a little bit of leaves here. So we're going to get back to that in a few moments. But those are the things I found. Similarly, you go in your fridge and you find what you find. But at any given time, I would recommend that you would have, at the very least, a bag of frozen vegetables, for example. You need to have vegetables. They're important. We need to eat more and more of them. That's the most important thing we can do for our health. So what's in there? That's the top question. If you come from a perspective of planning your meals as an omnivorous person that's a little bit meat-centered, probably meat-centered, that's how most people plan their meals, is they think, oh, is it going to be chicken or beef or fish, for example? But really, the most important nutrients that we need the most, that we're most possibly deficient of, come from vegetables. Nobody is protein deficient, but so many people are short on fiber, short on those phytonutrients that fight cancer, prevent dementia, keep our hearts healthy and our gut microbiome happy. So we need to think about those first. That's the most important question. Then we can ask ourselves, what do we have in the fridge and pantry in terms of beans and bean products? Those should occupy at the end about a quarter of the dish. And the top place to look at right now will be leftovers. You might also, by the way, have some leftover produce. In my case, earlier today, but it's gone now, I had leftover cooked sweet potatoes, but they were put into somebody's lunch, so they're gone. But if I did have cooked leftover produce, that would also be a priority to use them. But they can last a little bit longer than, say, herbs. It's a balance. Anyway, back to the beans and bean products. So if you have a leftover bean dish, which I think everyone should at least have 1 or 2 of those made every week, maybe in their minimum viable prep session on the weekend, something like a chili, a curry that has a lot of chickpeas, maybe chana masala, maybe a lentil dal, maybe a lentil salad made from French Desprez lentils or something else. So if you have a leftover bean dish, that is your #1 go-to thing. If you've already got something like baked slices of seasoned tofu, that's another good choice as well. So whatever bits and bobs you may have that are bean-centric from your fridge would be the first place to look now. Of course, great idea to always stock tofu, tempeh, and canned beans. So here I have a package of tempeh. I think this is a local brand. I'm not sure anymore. I admit that I don't use tempeh super often, but I'm getting better at using it. Now I know that I need to cook it through to get the taste to be right. And I love roasting it now, baking it in the oven with a little bit of a sweetener added to it. I'm moving towards having less and less sweetener on the tempeh, but for now, that's where I'm at. So I love using tempeh. Maybe that's what I would go for in this case. This is my favorite tofu. It is a firm, not extra firm, firm tofu that is calcium set. If you have not yet watched my tofu masterclass, please go ahead and watch it. And there's a lot of information about tofu there and all the different kinds, because tofu is not tofu. There's so many different types, not just the level of firmness, but the kinds of gelling agents that are used in them, coagulating agents. So you really have to watch, if you don't know yet, everything about tofu. I'm sure someone out there knows more about tofu than I do, but that's a pretty strong introduction to the topic. Having canned beans would be lower down on the list of priorities, because tofu, remember, goes bad. Especially if you have an open package of tofu, it's important to get eating it. You know, you keep the tofu leftovers in water or whatnot. That's wonderful, and you should use that first. But if you don't have tofu, if you don't have leftover cooked beans of any sort, then having canned beans is going to be how you compose your meal. And home-cooked beans, of course, are super important. If you have home-cooked beans in the freezer, then you can take those out, possibly even before using the ones that you have canned. So keeping your inventory in mind, opening the fridge and looking at what's there. Finally, now we're looking at the pantry, thinking about whole grains or possibly starchy vegetables that will occupy a quarter of the plate. Possibly you're not in the pantry, maybe you're still in the fridge if you have leftover cooked grains. In every minimum viable prep batch cooking session, I will prepare some kind of grains, either brown rice or quinoa. Sometimes, less often, I may have something more like millet or barley, something like that I will be using, or it can be a cooked grain dish, for example, leftover risotto. So if I have that, that should definitely come into my dish that I'm going to improvise. And noodles are some of my favorite things. So most noodles are not whole grains. There are whole grain noodles, like whole grain Italian style pasta. You can use those. I favor whole grains in general in my diet. And also, since I get so much fiber from all the beans and all the vegetables I consume, I don't sweat having whole grains at every single meal. So something to keep in mind, having noodles that may even be refined flour noodles, if that works for you, if they make you happy, if you don't struggle with blood sugar or anything like that, then having regular noodles and cooking those at the last minute can be fine. And of course, if you have leftover noodles, that's also great. And by the way, most pastas and rice and things like that, after having been refrigerated and reheated in your next meal, they will have much less impact on your blood sugar. So that can be an interesting thing to do, definitely preparing them on the weekend, but also making sure to keep your leftovers and reassembling them. And yeah, I don't personally sweat the whole grains question. Probably 2/3 of the grains I eat are whole grains, but having just regular noodles once in a while in my book is fine. Okay, so we've done the first step, which is reviewing everything we've got. And as we do that every single day, every time we open the fridge, we can pay attention and know what's in there. So the next step is to choose the dish. And really, you don't have to choose yourself. You have to ask the produce you found. So in my case, let's say I have this eggplant here, Japanese eggplant. I love using Japanese eggplants because they don't retain water so much compared to the conventional globe eggplant, apparently. So I see this eggplant and I ask the eggplant, what do you want to be? What do you want to be, eggplant? And I can ask the same question of the broccoli here. And it is not crazy to talk to your broccoli and say, hey, what do you want to be? And both of those vegetables right now are in pretty good firm shape. You know, the broccoli is not super soft. I'm going to make this workshop not too long so I can put them back in the fridge and enjoy them. The pepper is in great shape as well. They can totally be something like a stir fry because they will maintain their shape. They will maintain their crunch with higher heat. They will not go smooth and they will not go soft. And I will be able to integrate them in a really nice stir fry together. If I had found an eggplant that was sad and a little bit soft, then maybe I would be more interested in doing something like soup, where it will simmer, it will become soft if I find a bunch of mushrooms that are, they're still good to eat, but they're less appealing, sort of. Same thing for sad cauliflower, for example. Those would be better off in soup format. You know, carrots that are no longer crunchy, they don't belong in a stir fry. They belong in a soup where they're going to simmer and become comforting, and they will have their true moment to shine in that situation. Whereas if you put them in a stir fry, they're going to shine a lot less. Or go back to that carrot that's a bit sad. Well, the worst place to put it would be in a salad because nobody wants to eat sad, wilted, mushy carrots, right? In a soup, no one will notice. In a bowl or a salad, it will be in plain sight and very unappealing. So those are the three main types. The soups or stews, so dishes that are simmered for at least 20 minutes, possibly quite a bit longer. Stir fries, dishes that are assembled at higher heat, not high heat, but medium heat as opposed to medium low. Stir fries, they go fast. You can see the different components to them. And bowls and salads are the third category of healthy vegan dishes that I suggest you improvise from. Of course, as I was mentioning earlier, there are many other things you can do with plants, but having these three basic shapes for day-to-day cooking is going to be a lot easier than thinking about more complicated dishes. Keep in mind that some of those dishes will be combined with other kinds of building blocks. For example, so a soup has more liquid, a stew has less liquid, and my favorite stew, perhaps, is a vegan bolognese sauce that I get to serve on noodles, on pasta noodles. So they go together. Spaghetti bolognese is not a separate category of its own. You have to understand that it's a combination of that building blocks, the pasta, with the simmered, slow simmered sauce, the vegan bolognese sauce, that go together. So if I find a wilted carrot, I may think you would belong very well along with an onion, perhaps a branch of celery, in a sauce that I would call a stew, but we don't really call it a stew, we call it a sauce, but it is a stew, it is a simmered dish. And I would bring it together, that carrot, into that sauce and serve it on top of those noodles. So the veggies are really going to be telling you what is going on tonight. You don't have to make the decision, just look at them. Let them speak to you and let them decide. This parsley here is perfectly content going into that bolognese sauce that I'm going to make with a wilted carrot, for example, if that's what I have. But the cilantro won't really make a super nice showing. Cilantro would be used more in something like a stir fry, maybe, or that's what I was thinking when I bought the cilantro. That's probably how I used it. But at this stage, the cilantro has seen better days. I can imagine it in the blender. I think that would be the best use of what's left of the cilantro, putting it in the blender or the food processor, maybe with some of this parsley here, and maybe with nuts or with beans, depending on what I have in the pantry, to create a pesto. And I can make it very thick, and I can spread it on bread and make myself a pesto tofu sandwich, for example. But that's not one of the forms there, but maybe I can make them into a sauce with a little bit more liquid that I would then drizzle on top of a bowl. We're going to get back to that in a moment. But those are uses that when I look at them, I can see in their future what are some good possibilities. I feel the need to hide the cilantro because it's really a little bit sad there. Okay, so number one, we've looked at what we have. Number two, we've asked what we have. What do you want to be when you become a meal? So we've chosen either something like super stew, stir fry, or bowl or salad. That choice will also depend on our energy level. I'm going to get back to that in just a moment. Then the third step is to take another look now at the pantry side at the kinds of seasonings and condiments and spices that you have. Actually, some of that might be in the fridge too. Many of us are guilty of this, I'm sure, buying a nice, interesting, fancy condiment for maybe a recipe that we've done once, and then we abandoned the rest. Or maybe we bought this special kind of hot sauce, something I remember buying some time ago, ancho powder. I've refilled an existing bottle of spice here with ancho powder. It's a little bit smoky. It's quite delicious, but I don't use it often enough. So maybe I look at my pantry and I think ancho powder, today's your day. And that will be a good combination with oregano because it's more of a Mexican kind of style thing. I don't want to be too reductionist here. Within Mexico, there's many culinary traditions, but let's just take a shortcut because it's Wednesday night at 5 p.m. and we need to make a decision about what's for dinner. And maybe smoked paprika. And believe it or not, for those who are familiar with the Vegan Family Kitchen, this doesn't happen often. My cumin jar is empty. That's a disaster. I love cumin. So these things together will be the flavor profile maybe for the dish I'm making. However, if I had chosen to do the spaghetti sauce, then I would be looking for more Italian herbs, things like if I'm making that vegan bolognese sauce. Or if I'm deciding that what's most urgent to use is those greens, I can imagine doing something a little bit more like Middle Eastern-ish. Using, maybe I have turmeric here, for example. I would definitely use cumin again, and maybe a little coriander, perhaps with a pinch of cinnamon or something like that. But you can think about the culinary traditions of different broad geographic regions and combine 2 or 3 spices or seasonings that go well together. If you're going to do something that's more Asian, then maybe you could think ginger, chili, maybe if you have a lime that would go in there with the cilantro and a bit of soy sauce. Those kinds of combinations. So think of the flavor profiles. If you're not yet familiar with the flavor profiles, I talk about them at some length in my course, Plan, Prep, and Relax. I mentioned them in my book, Flow in the Kitchen. And if you know how to search the internet, I'm sure you are going to find lots of information about different flavor profiles. But what you need to learn from me is it's okay to keep it simple. I have sometimes made a stir fry with just soy sauce. And of course, onion, garlic, and ginger. And it was delicious. It didn't need to have the addition of any kinds of fancy other spices. It was just great the way it was. Finally, you've made some decisions. So it's time to cook things up. Think of it, for those of you who are musicians, like jazz standards, the basic melodies that we hear over and over again. Sometimes we hear again the same set of chords in different songs. And I'm like, wait a minute, we've heard this before. If you're like me, not a musician, then it just seems a little familiar. But if you're a musician, you know right away that you're hearing again some of the standards of your art. And in the same way in cooking, you can think of it as standards, progressions of chords that are just pretty much always the same, but the different ingredients that come in will be a little different. Super stew. In the cheat sheet, I've been very generous in providing complex instructions for making soup. The reality is that you can throw the ingredients that you want in your soup or stew all in a pot. It can be a slow cooker. I just love using the slow cooker. Check out my blog post about why I still think using a slow cooker is a great idea. I love it more than my Instant Pot. I do use the Instant Pot, but I love my slow cooker so much. Put everything in there, cover with broth, and put it on low for 6 to 8 hours, and there you go, you have soup. You can do something very similar in a pot on the stove. This is here, oh, it's heavy. This is a family heirloom. This was my mom's eldest sister pot for beans. This was purchased, I think, in 1962, probably. A big, heavy pot, enamel cast iron. It's an original creuset from the 60s. And I just start warming this up. If I'm going to make soup, I start chopping the vegetables and I put them in as I go, as I chop. You don't need to chop everything first. You just pop them into the pot as you chop. And then once everything is in there, deglazing is very important. If you don't know what deglazing is, I talk about it in my book, and every time I teach a cooking class, that's super important. So deglazing means removing the sugars from the bottom, pouring in a little bit of a cold liquid, whether it's a vinegar, balsamic vinegar, apple cider vinegar, a little bit of it, even lemon juice, or even water or broth, and scraping the bottom really quick. And it releases those sugars. It makes dishwashing faster at the end, but also makes all the food more flavorful. Adding the cooked beans, or if you're using dry lentils, you can do that. Put them in, add vegetable broth to cover, and simmer for 20 minutes. You got soup. That's the soup section. There's other ways to make soup. I talk about that in a lot more detail in the course, Cooking Without Thinking. There's multiple different ways to make soup, but that's just the basic instructions. Stir fry. How do you do a stir fry? In my case, I have this big cast iron wok that I use once in a while, but recently, since I got an air fryer, I've started cooking the tofu or tempeh or whatnot separately in the air fryer. Meanwhile, cooking the vegetables in my somewhat smaller cast iron skillet here. I guess that's 12 inches. So I start warming this up and cooking first the bean product, setting it aside, and then doing the vegetables one at a time on medium heat. Adding the delicate ginger and garlic at the end. People that cook with a lot of oil, they will typically cook the garlic and ginger at the beginning to infuse the oil with the wonderful flavor of the garlic and ginger. However, I don't use very much or any oil when I cook. So I find that putting the ginger and garlic first just burns them a little bit. Instead, I prefer to add them at the end to keep the freshness of the flavor. And then mix it all together, sprinkle with nuts and seeds, and you have yourself a great stir fry. Keep in mind that maybe you're using leftovers. So if you have leftover tofu from a previous meal or from a meal prep session, you don't need to cook it in the skillet. You warm it up, microwave. Microwave is fine. Just use your microwave, warm it up, and throw it in at the end. So having done a little bit of minimum viable prep, having done some also what I call cascade cooking, preserving the leftovers from one meal as a building block to build and be part of the next meal. So that will create some shortcuts for you. Finally, bowls and salads. I find it strange that when people start cooking vegan food, the first thing often that they are taught to cook is a bowl or a salad. It seems like the vegan bowl is something that everybody is supposed to be doing. And I find it to be the most complex aspect because in a bowl, you have these different piles of different preparations as opposed to a soup where you just dump everything together with the broth and you cook it all up. A bowl can be somewhat complex. The only circumstance personally in which I make a bowl is when I have leftover building blocks from previous meals that I've accumulated. And with practice now, I'm pretty good at having always a slight diversity of building blocks. It varies from week to week. And then I bring together the grains, the bean products, a big bed of green and or cruciferous vegetables with at least 2 other colorful vegetables on top. Drizzle with a sauce. I love having made a sauce or some kind of dressing. This is where this would come in on the weekend, but I can throw it together really quick. At dinner time, if I already have the cooked beans and I already have the cooked grains and I have boxed greens, so I don't need to worry about preparing that, then I can take 5 minutes to create a green goddess kind of dressing, for example, at the time of dinner. So I will assemble all that. And here's the kicker. If it's a salad, you just toss it all together instead of keeping the pieces separate as in a bowl. In short, that's how you do it. First step, look at what you have. And I guess before the first step, to be totally honest, it involves having a rhythm of stocking some categories of produce that you can always count on having, and having the backup of frozen veggies. Frozen veggies, in my case, if that's what it was down to on any given week, it would probably end up in the situation of a soup or stew. It might end up in a stir fry if the frozen veggies have been in my fridge for less than a month, but that's rare. I find that frozen veggies start to degrade after a month, so I would probably not use them in a stir fry, and I would not recommend using them in a bowl or a salad because they're not going to be the best player in that context. So first of all, review what you have and interrogate them very gently. Listen to what they have to say about what they want to become. Combine that with a flavor profile based on seasonings that you have and existing condiments, and then cook it all up following those simple instructions. At the bottom of the worksheet, I say something that is so important that I should be repeating multiple times all the time. Taste often and adjust seasoning. The beauty of vegan foods is that even things like uncooked tofu, they're already cooked. And even if they weren't cooked, they wouldn't kill you. There's no salmonella or stuff like that on plant foods. So you're not going to get trichinosis from eating chickpeas ever. That's a disease you get from eating undercooked pork. Okay, so you can taste the tofu when you put it in the skillet before it starts cooking. You can taste it midway through to say, is it flavorful enough? Take a spoonful of your soup and decide, should I add a little more oregano, or is it short on cumin, or maybe this needs a little bit of spice? Go ahead, taste and adjust seasoning. Trust yourself to know what you enjoy and find delicious. That's really important. So having said all that, I am going to go into a lot more detail if you're a beginner at cooking without thinking, or if you're already kind of good, but you'd like to maybe think of it in different ways, really think of it in terms of a grammar as opposed to think of it in terms of recipes. I strongly encourage you to join the waitlist for my summer course called Cooking Without Thinking. It's going to have a lot of instruction about how to make soup, so many different ways, how to make stir fries, and how to assemble salads and bowls. And you can practice those. There's going to be homework. So the thing about working with me is that there's homework. You can't just watch the videos and then move on and watch some other video. I fully expect you to practice, share your results, and learn from what's going on. Because if you don't practice, if you just watch this video today and then you go and you download a recipe, or you open a cookbook and you take a recipe from a cookbook and you do exactly what's in there, you're not going to have learned very much. And this is going to have been wasted time. So key here is to be intentional, to practice, to really look, to really smell, to rely on your senses, to taste often. And when you eat, I'm going to connect this also to the practice of mindful eating. When you're eating, really paying attention to what you're eating. You spent all this effort cooking something. So please give yourself the gift of observing the results of your effort, of really tasting the fruit of your work. And you know what? Sometimes maybe it's not going to be great. It happens to me where I taste the dish and for whatever reason, it's a little disappointing. And that's a learning opportunity. If I remember what I did, if I paid attention as I was cooking, then I'm able to learn lessons from what I was doing and do things a little bit differently next time. And also, more importantly and more commonly, as I eat, I can be fully grateful for all the food that is in front of me. I can observe the beauty of that pepper, of those beans, of those tofu. Even the wilted cilantro still has something to bring and adds amazing flavor that will enhance my experience. And not just that, I can sense those beautiful foods going into my body and giving me energy and also healing me from the constant onslaught of pollution and all those things. So I can think about the foods making me better, building me every day, and increasing my wellness, and feeling the gratitude for all the forces of the universe that are coming together with my help, because I made this dish. I opened the fridge, I looked at what was there, I had conversations with the vegetables, figuring out what was the best way to make them shine. I created the meal, and now I get to enjoy it. And there's so much to be grateful for. It takes a little bit of skill, it takes a little bit of paying attention, but it's totally worth it. So I hope you will join me in continuing this journey of cooking without thinking. And I would love to hear from you what your experience is, how it's working out, what you feel you would like to learn, what you feel you've done that you could improve upon, and what your successes have been as well. I look forward to the discussion in the comments below. And it's been a pleasure to have you today in the Vegan Family Kitchen.